Half an hour later, Lu Qingshan and Lan Zu came into a residence that looked like Yifeng's residence. They opened the door and carefully entered, politely calling out for Yifeng. As they entered Yifeng's residence, they were greeted by an elegant courtyard, weird statues, and strange paintings. Lu Qingshan's eyes bulged out, and his mouth was agape when he noticed the paintings. He was surrounded by the aura being emitted by the paintings, and he couldn't help but praise their powerful force. Voices could be heard from the paintings, and as one of them was looking for a fight, threatening that it would slice again, the other didn't want to fight as its scabbard had moved. And although Lu Qingshan couldn't understand a word, he could deeply feel that those paintings must be some kind of wonderful artwork, and he said that he felt that it was as if the paintings were telling him about sect disputes, strengths, and weaknesses, and how it was just a passing moment. Lan Zu was surprised when she saw Lu Qingshan suddenly kneel on the ground, completely enlightened, and say that he understood. Suddenly, Zhang King, who was still catching his breath and holding a feather duster, appeared in front of Lu Qingshan and Lan Zu, who were surprised, and asked them if the two of them were guests. Lan Zu smiled, while Lu Qingshan nervously laughed as they both apologized and introduced themselves as people from the Qingshan sect. Upon hearing that the two of them were from the Qingshan sect, Zhang King's expression darkened, and he thought that it was over for him. He then wondered if the two of them were there to catch him for sneaking into the Qingshan gate. Lan Zu was surprised, along with Lu Qingshan, whose eyes bulged out of their sockets when Zhang King quickly dashed and knelt in front of them, apologizing and promising that he would not dare to sneak into the Qingshan gate again, asking for the two of them to spare his life, and saying that he was very thin, so they shouldn't feed him to the dog. The two of them were flabbergasted, and they didn't know what to do, so Lan Zu reached out to Zhang King, asking him to get up and asking him what he was doing. But as Lan Zu reached out to Zhang King, another hand reached out too. It was Lu Qingshan, and he grabbed Lan Zu's hand, lectured her, and told her not to be rude. And he told her that he once heard that Buddha was also a Western deity that tested the believer to see if they had a clean heart or not. Realizing her mistake, Lan Zu's eyes filled with terror, and she started sweating profusely. And as she looked at Zhang King, who was bowing in front of them, she saw the Western and Eastern Buddhas depicted behind him, and she wondered if Zhang King was sent by Yifeng to test them. Addressing Zhang King as a girl, they suddenly noticed that he was holding a feather duster. Lu Qingshan gritted his teeth. He was sweating profusely as he stared at the item, trying to figure out what it meant, and in his mind, he thought about how the feather duster was used to remove dust. Removing dust meant to remove distracting thoughts, and only by throwing away distracting thoughts could they accomplish anything. Figuring out what the feather duster meant with a serious look on his face, Lu Qingshan announced that it must be the first trial that Yifeng hinted at them. So at that moment, they should let Yifeng have a good experience of their sincerity, and Lan Zu, who looked as serious as him, responded that she understood. Meanwhile, Zhang King looked at them with an expressionless face as he couldn't understand what was going on. With his eyes full of determination, Lu Qingshan told Lan Zu that they should clean up the dust, to which Lan Zu added that they should get rid of all miscellaneous thoughts. With their game faces on, they wielded the cleaning tools as if they were weapons and posed as if they were going into a fight, while Lu Qingshan initiated that they should start cleaning, to which Lan Zu responded affirmatively. On the other hand, Zhang King panicked when he saw what they were doing and told them that they really didn't need to do such things as it was all his job. He questioned them if they really were the cultivators of the Qingshan Gate and added, correcting them, that he was a boy. A few moments later, at Yifeng's martial arts courtyard, the sun had already set, the crescent moon had filled the sky, and Yifeng was telling Lan Zu to forget about earlier because he was glad that she was there to pay for the book, so he would forgive her. Then he asked them to stay for dinner. In the kitchen, while Yifeng was handing out the Prince of the Wolf Clan to Zhang King, saying that they should eat dog meat hot pot that night, Lan Zu and Lu Qingshan were sitting at a table where they were served fruits. They observed Yifeng, and Lan Zu whispered to Lu Qingshan, asking him if he saw anything in Yifeng. Lu Qingshan told her that he couldn't see through Yifeng's cultivation base and concluded that his strength was unfathomable. While Yifeng skillfully sliced the ingredients for his cooking, Lan Zu and Lu Qingshan were observing him. Lu Qingshan told Lan Zu to take a look and pointed out that Yifeng's knife technique looked ordinary, but the sliced ingredients seemed to be reborn again. Continuing to observe Yifeng, Lu Qingshan gritted his teeth and asked Lan Zu if she saw the wolf. Terror filled Lu Qingshan's eyes, and he sweated profusely. He looked at the Prince of the Wolf Clan that was glaring at him while being tied down by a rope and said that if he was not mistaken, that wolf was the rarest one among the monsters, the sky-devouring demon wolf. He couldn't believe that Yifeng was going to use the demon wolf as his food. While Yifeng held his butcher knife, he grabbed the demon wolf by its head, which in turn shrouded itself in aura, and Lan Zu, who had looked at the scene with her eyes filled with worry, said that if they really ate the demon wolf, the demon race wouldn't rest easy, so she was afraid that for the rest of Yifeng's life, he would be chased to death by the demon wolf clan. while Lu Qingshan inconspicuously whispered behind Yifeng's back and told the expectant Lan Zu that those who dared to do such a thing were probably not limited to the realm of Martial Emperor, because in the rebellion of the gods and demons, it was the demon wolves who dragged the attack of 30,000 Buddhas with the power of the clan that allowed the defeated demon clan to survive. Zhang King looked at them incredulously and wondered if they were all right. Suddenly, the demon wolf broke free from the ropes, and as it bared its fangs and roared, Lu Qingshan pointed it out and said that it was ready to fight to the death. Yifeng was surprised when the demon wolf broke free from the ropes by breaking them into pieces, but instead of fighting him to the death like Lu Qingshan said, the demon wolf knelt on the ground and begged Yifeng not to eat him. While Yifeng smiled brightly at the demon wolf, patting its head, saying that it looked just a little bit like the one he had raised before he crossed, and offering it to be his pet, Lu Qingshan had his mouth wide open in surprise, and he was speechless as he could not believe that the demon wolf surrendered and begged for mercy. As Yifeng stepped out of the kitchen, carrying the demon lord in his arms, and called out for Zhang King to look at the dog, Lu Qingshan looked away from the scene as he trembled while tears ran down his cheeks. He admired how kind Yifeng had been for letting go of the demon wolf at the last moment, but Lan Zu gently reminded him that it was not the time to be moved. Picturing the butcher knife that Yifeng had wielded earlier, Lan Zu thought that perhaps borrowing a magic weapon from an expert was not a problem, and besides, the knife had just stunned the demon wolf, who had been at the pinnacle of martial arts. Despite being nervous, Lan Zu stood behind Yifeng and gave him a fist palm salute, and with all due respect, she begged him to lend her his knife to save her sect from extinction. With an intimidating look on his face, Yifeng turned to look at her to seek further information. Lu Qingshan panicked to the extent that he slammed Lan Zu's head into the ground and called her an idiot, reprimanding her for exposing her greed like that. Lu Qingshan and Lan Zu faced each other, and they were both sweating profusely and anxious as they realized that Yifeng was not happy anymore. Holding the butcher knife in his hand, Yifeng stood there with an ominous aura shrouding him. But to their surprise, Yifeng handed them the butcher knife with a deadpan expression, saying that if they wanted to borrow it, they could take it as it was not a valuable thing. Upon seeing that they were surprised and speechless, Yifeng asked them what was up and told them to take the butcher knife as he could make 2 or 3 of those in a day. Lu Qingshan thanked Yifeng, and the butcher knife was filled with tears as he held it carefully in his hands. While Lan Zu rejoiced and Lu Qingshan cried, saying that the heavens' blessings seemed to be still on their Qingshan sect's side. Yifeng turned his back on them and thought that they were so pitiful and poor that they couldn't even afford a kitchen knife. The morning had already come, and Lu Qingshan excitedly announced that Ning Xianwu would be dead. On the other hand, at the Xuanwu sect, someone landed on their ground, and the disciples scurried to prepare their master, Ning Xianwu's meal, as his retreat was over. Sitting on his throne half naked, Ning Xianwu told his disciples that there was no need. He instructed them to bring the messenger from Qingshan Gate as he wanted to see him and told the others to leave, to which all of them responded affirmatively. A few moments later, at the Xuanwu sect's secret room, Ning Xianwu was already fully clothed. Behind him, a man in a cloak bowed and introduced himself as Yu Wuji, who greeted him and told him that he had heard a lot about him, but Ning Xianwu told him not to be hypocritical and just say something, to which he complied. In a suspenseful manner, Yu Wuji told Ning Xianwu that he was there to tell him something that day. And as Yu Wuji told Ning Xianwu that what he had been worried about the other day had indeed happened, Ning Xianwu turned his head and looked at Yu Wuji with a scowl on his face. At the Xuanwu sect's secret room, a candle burned brightly. Yu Wuji was in there with Ning Xianwu, reporting how Lu Qingshan had stepped into the realm of Martial King not long ago, but Ning Xianwu was not threatened by the news. He proudly said that, as everyone else knew, he had been in the realm of Martial King for more than 30 years, so Lu Qingshan was nothing more than a toddler who had just learned to walk. Ning Xianwu sat down as he presumed that if it was just what Yu Wuji wanted to say, then he wouldn't have come there late at night, so he told him that they should talk about the important point, which Yu Wuji complied with. With a serious face, Yu Wuji told Ning Xianwu that earlier that day, Lu Qingshan had hurried back from the outside and summoned all his disciples to the square. Yu Wuji recalled the earlier event as he was one of the disciples that had been summoned to the square, and he had yawned as he asked the Qingshan sect teacher, Zhu Yun, what had happened to Lu Qingshan and why he had wanted them to gather so late. But Zhu Yun had told him that she didn't know as she had just been told that it was a trial. As they looked ahead, Yu Wuji was surprised to see what was in front of them and was rendered speechless, while one of the disciples commented that they were looking at the Qingshan sect test jewel, an extremely tough and indestructible jewel that, even with a heavy blow with a magic weapon, would only leave a few scratches. As they arrived at the square where everyone had gathered in front of the gigantic test jewel, where Lu Qingshan stood, the other disciples noticed them and quickly paid their respect to Zhu Yun, but she told them that there was no need to be polite. After much concentration, Lu Qingshan opened his eyes and glared at the test jewel in front of him. He touched the huge test jewel with his left hand, and he swung Yifeng's kitchen knife in his right. The disciples were both surprised and disappointed when they saw what weapon Lu Qingshan was holding, and Zhu Yun even questioned what the point of trying was when he would just be using a broken kitchen knife. One of the disciples sighed and said that Lu Qingshan was under too much pressure, and they had to call the doctor in advance. Upon hearing his disciples talk, Lu Qingshan's nerves popped, and he was annoyed at those wide-eyed wolves talking coldly to his face. But as he was about to use the kitchen knife, Lu Qingshan realized something that stopped him in his tracks. He thought that the power of the knife was still unknown, so it was better to do it gently first. He gave the test jewel a light tap with the kitchen knife, and a crack was already visible. But to his surprise, it did not end there. The test jewel was completely obliterated when an explosive amount of aura was released, and the aura was so strong that the bystander disciples had to protect themselves from its pressure with their arms as it surged towards the sky. The aura shot towards the dark skies, and it could be seen from far away. The parts of the test jewel that were smashed into pieces exploded in all directions. On the other hand, the debris of the explosion reached Jiangping City, where Zhang King was witnessing the phenomenon while she raised up the demon wolf, telling it to take a look at the spectacular meteor swarm. But the demon wolf did not find it as spectacular as Zhang King did, as panic filled his eyes when he saw the meteor spreading and flying in their direction. And he called Zhang King a stupid woman in his head while he recognized that the powerful martial intent and coercion were peerless magic weapons, and he wondered when those cultivators possessed such weapons. Meanwhile, Yifeng was passing by the window in his house, and as the red light filled the room, the scenery of the explosion outside caught his attention. Yifeng's eyes widened and his mouth was wide open as he seemed to have recognized the power that was surging from the explosion. He closed his eyes and joined his palms together. He thought that he was seeing a shooting star and started wishing for him to be able to sit in the harem with countless women and have a lot of money. So if he wanted to eat, he would only need to open his mouth, and if he wanted to wear clothes, he only needed to stretch out his hands. His prayers stretched into 1,000 words. Back at the Qingshan sect square, every disciple was surprised. Zhu Yun's eyes bulged out of their sockets, and she was rendered speechless while Yu Wuji cursed and asked what it was. While Lu Qingshan looked at the kitchen knife with a terrified look on his face, the disciples behind him rejoiced as their Qingshan sect was saved. After processing what had just happened, Lu Qingshan's face lit up, and he couldn't believe that he had been able to try the weapon earlier, and that he hadn't even hit hard at all. He quickly fell in love with the power of the knife that was too domineering. But then, the realization hit Lu Qingshan that he didn't have to use the knife until he had to because it was beyond his control, and that made him realize that Yifeng, who had made the knife, was probably above the realm of martial ancestor. With the pile of rocks crumbling behind him, Lu Qingshan turned to face his disciples and announced that the day after tomorrow, he would wait for the Xuanwu sect and fight to the death, which made his disciples cheer him on in return. Back to the present, Yu Wuji squinted his eyes and said that based on Lu Qingshan's talent, it was not possible for him to break through so quickly. Ning Xianwu crossed his arms while he listened to Yu Wuji say that the same was true for the magic weapon that Lu Qingshan had gotten, so he suspected that someone must have been behind him to help him. Ning Xianwu furrowed his brow, and he seemed to be deep in his thoughts as he was not saying anything. Looking up at Ning Xianwu anxiously, Yu Wuji asked him if they should do something. Suddenly, Ning Xianwu tossed a blue pill and told Yu Wuji that the poison of the ice toad had been attacking his body for 3 days. Yu Wuji's eyes widened as he saw the blue pill pass right before his eyes. Ning Xianwu turned to walk away. He told Yu Wuji that it was his reward for his tip-off that day, so he should work hard because after he was done, he would set him free. And upon hearing what he said, Yu Wuji knelt on the ground while the blue pill rolled in front of him and thanked Ning Xianwu for his kindness. A lady stood in the shadows near the entrance of the Xuanwu sect secret room, and as Ning Xianwu approached her, he called her Linger and told her to follow him to the sword graveyard. The lady was Lin Yan, a female disciple of the Xuanwu sect, and she looked excited as she leaned on the door frame and told Ning Xianwu that she couldn't wait. A few moments later, at the sword graveyard, one disciple reminded his brother about their master's instruction while he was still alive that the soul-dementing sword in the sword graveyard must never be unsealed. But the other disciple told him to stop talking nonsense and open the seal for him, so the other one complied and told the other that he shouldn't regret it. But the seal glowed in front of them before they could do anything to open it, and they were surprised. Ghastly spirits poured out from the door, which made the two disciples run for their lives. Those ghastly spirits drained the life out of the things they passed through. Birds dropped lifelessly to the ground, and plants dried out. Meanwhile, Ning Xianwu and Ling Yan were unaffected by the spirits as they shrouded themselves in aura, and while they floated in the air, Ling Yan said that she did not expect the magic weapon sealed in that graveyard would be so dangerous, which made Ning Xianwu laugh and tell her that it was just the beginning because after eradicating the Qingshan Gate, regardless of the gods or demons, everyone would kneel beneath his feet. With a sinister grin on his face, Ning Xianwu looked ahead and told Lin Yan not to ever doubt his ambition. As they saw the soul-dementing sword rise in front of them, Ning Xianwu declared that he was going to use that magic weapon to defeat the magic weapon. Meanwhile, the ghastly spirits continued to run amok and swirl around a large rock. Somebody arrived at Zhongping City and was surprised to see that it was all empty. There were 3 of them, and they were panting and running around the city looking for medical supplies. One of them started to panic as it had already been less than 4 hours before the decisive battle with the Xuanwu sect, while the other one started to cry and said that even without them, Lu Qingshan could definitely win. The 3 of them looked ahead with serious looks on their faces and said that the kind of duel that was about to happen would eventually affect mortals, so it was okay if they all escaped because if they encountered a little spiritual power, they would die on the spot. Meanwhile, Yifeng was hiking somewhere in the mountains. He was leading the residents of Zhongping City, and they had their packed bags with them. Yifeng suddenly stopped and struck the ground with a wooden pole. Yifeng was carrying a sphere with a red flag tied on its end, and as he gestured towards the higher ground he was standing on, he announced that they had found a good place to watch the duel, which made the residents rejoice as they had been waiting for that duel for a long time. Meanwhile, Yifeng was drooling as he thought about how it was a business opportunity because, although he didn't know who was fighting, there were so many people who wanted to watch that kind of fight, and the location was the highest point around Zhongping City, so the duel could be seen at a glance no matter where it was. As the people crowded towards the edge of the cliff, Yifeng announced that those who wanted to borrow binoculars should line up. He was renting them out for 1 gold for single use, and he encouraged them to grab them as it was a time-limited offer, which caused a commotion as people wanted one. Meanwhile, at the bottom of the cliff, Ning Xianwu and Lu Qingshan stood face to face with each other, and their disciples gathered behind each of them. They both stared off at each other. Ning Xianwu then smiled mockingly as he told Lu Qingshan that he did not expect him to have the courage to attend the battlefield, and hearing that made Lu Qingshan grit his teeth and tell Ning Xianwu that at that moment, there was no certainty on who would live and who would die. As one of them started lunging for an attack, the crowd started cheering. Their movements were so fast that only their colorful auras clashing with each other could be seen. But at the end of the clash, Ning Xianwu overpowered Lu Qingshan, and he was able to punch him in the face, causing Lu Qingshan to cough up blood. Lu Qingshan fell to the ground, and 3 of his disciples quickly dashed towards him to check up on him. But Lu Qingshan quickly stood up like nothing had happened and instructed his disciples not to come. While Ning Xianwu emitted an enormous and intimidating amount of aura in front of him, Lu Qingshan admitted to himself that his realm was already far behind Ning Xianwu, and if he hadn't been promoted to the realm of Martial King after reading Yifeng's book, he would have been unable to fight at that moment. And as Lu Qingshan thought that he could only pin his hope on something, Ning Xianwu called out to him with a sinister aura. He told him that he knew what he was up to and provoked him to show it up, his magic weapon. Lu Qingshan was so surprised that his face turned pale, his eyes bulged out, and his mouth was wide open while he was sweating profusely, wondering how Ning Xianwu knew about his magic weapon. While Lu Qingshan was surprised, along with his other disciples, Yu Wuji stood behind him and sneered at him. With an evil smile, Ning Xianwu asked Lu Qingshan if he thought he would let his sneak attack succeed. He jumped off the ground, and he extended his arms as he released the Soul Eater sword, releasing the ghastly spirits along with it. The Xuanwu sect disciples rejoiced as they saw the magic weapon, while Lin Yan proudly smiled and said that the Soul Eater sword, which could only be used once by consuming decades of life, could easily erode the spiritual power of any weapon, so the weapons below the holy objects were just like a handful of weapons in front of it. Meanwhile, Lu Qingshan nervously and hesitantly pulled out the ordinary kitchen knife from behind him, and upon seeing it, the Qingshan Gate disciples were horrified and said that their sect was over because no matter what weapon it was, it would be restrained by the Soul Eater sword. As Lu Qingshan raised the ordinary kitchen knife to protect himself, Ning Xianwu, who was surrounded by the ghastly spirits, laughed as he couldn't believe that Lu Qingshan's magic weapon was really a kitchen knife. The disciples of the Xuanwu laughed too, including Lin Yan, and as one of the disciples questioned what a broken knife could even do, another commented that the dignified ancestor Lu Qingshan unexpectedly turned into a fool who used a knife to fight against the Soul Eater sword, which cracked up the other disciples. Meanwhile, during the fight, Lu Qingshan was backed into the edge of the cliff by Ning Xianwu, who was mocking and taunting him to show him how strong his magic weapon broken kitchen knife was. Lu Qingshan trembled as he looked at the kitchen knife in his hand and cursed in his mind, saying that he had lost momentum as he was worried about the kitchen knife in his hand because, after all, he had borrowed it from Yifeng. As Lu Qingshan thought about what would happen if the kitchen knife's spiritual power was eaten away by the Soul Eater sword and it became an ordinary knife, snot came out of his nose as he trembled and cried out loud, asking Yifeng what he should do. Suddenly, someone yelled, cheering for Lu Qingshan to hang in there. It was Yifeng, and as he stood at the edge of the cliff, with the people behind him using the binoculars he had rented to watch the fight, he gestured his hand and asked Lu Qingshan how he could give up so easily. While the people behind him continued to watch the fight using the binoculars, Yifeng yelled that they had finished fighting so quickly that he had made more than a dozen binoculars for nothing. So it was up to them how much money he could make, and in his mind, he thought that the binoculars were all rented out and he didn't know what exactly was going on down there, who was with whom and what the situation was. Lu Qingshan's eyes popped out as soon as Yifeng's voice reached his ears. He saw Yifeng standing at the edge of the cliff above him, yelling at him unintelligibly while a lot of people with binoculars stood behind him. Lu Qingshan's jaw dropped when he recognized Yifeng and saw that he had actually brought so many people to the battlefield to cheer him on. Determination filled Lu Qingshan's eyes as he thought about how he had just heard Yifeng encourage him, and he exclaimed to his god about what a supreme encouragement it had been. He raised the kitchen knife in the air proudly as he realized how shameful it had been for him to be timid in front of the enemy, and he had almost insulted the honor of the knife. Lu Qingshan dug his feet into the ground to gain momentum, and with a determined look on his face, Lu Qingshan released his golden aura while glaring at the enemy as he declared to himself that he knew what to do. Ning Xianwu stood in front of him, still surrounded by the ghastly spirits, while he held the Soul Eater sword, and he continued to mock Lu Qingshan, asking him what the matter was and if he was planning on cutting cans. Ning Xianwu jumped up in the air, and as he gestured his sword towards Lu Qingshan, who was standing still below him, the ghastly spirits lunged towards Lu Qingshan simultaneously. Lu Qingshan swung the kitchen knife towards him as he prepared to slash the ghastly spirits in front of him. And as he was about to swing out the kitchen knife, he was surprised when the ghastly spirits reached him first. But despite all of it, Lu Qingshan was still able to swing the knife at full force, releasing a slashing golden aura, and used the skill, Usual Ordinary Knife Attack, which effortlessly sliced through the ghastly spirits. Lu Qingshan's golden slash was so strong that it was able to reach Ning Xianwu, who was extremely surprised by the kitchen knife's strength. Ning Xianwu screamed in pain as the golden aura started to dissolve him into nothingness. The disciples of the Xuanwu sect were surprised when they saw the kitchen knife's power, and how it was able to actually smash the Soul Eater sword with just a single attack, while Ling Yar looked worried and called out for her master, Ning Xianwu. The golden aura continued to move forward, and it sliced the rocks that were in its way, creating a trench on the ground.